Welcome to our podcast. Anita talks history and genealogy. Glad you could join us. And we want you to check out the video. We want you to like, subscribe, share, and if you have a comment, feel free to comment. Tonight, we are talking about some people who were redesignated. I call it racially redesignated or whatever. Before the colonizers came, before the European colonizers came, natives identified themselves by tribe, by their totem poles, by their tribal markings. They did not call themselves Indian. They didn't call themselves Indigenous or, mulatto colored or none of the labels that were given by the Europeans. They were identified by tribe. And each tribe knew the markings of their tribe, of their people. They knew the looks and who they were, and they also knew where their territory was. So when the Europeans came, they began designating territory, putting up borders and boundaries, and splitting the tribes so that where the colonial settlers, so they had like 13 original colonies. So they were up and down the eastern seaboard, those states that were on the eastern seaboard, like I think it was from Maine to probably South Carolina or something like that. But anyway, these were the colonial, the colonies, the 13 original colonies. And what they did was they reset the borders that natives and other indigenous people had set up and had been, that they each understood, so that the Mohawks understood where the Seneca, territory was. And, so wherever the Cherokee were, they understood who, maybe the Creek territory was. Everybody understood and respected the boundaries. They didn't have to have fences. They just had a respect for the privacy of their neighboring tribes, and or I would say their neighboring villages, because they probably didn't call themselves tribes. Tribalism is more, to me, European. And anyway, so I want to talk about my ancestors who were in North Carolina, in what is now called North Carolina. But they were in that territory of what is now called South Carolina, North Carolina, and Southern Virginia. And it was, there's a place called Sheraw, North Carolina, and they were in that region. So the tribes, most of the native tribes, they would have a village, and it was usually by a river, but they also would go and move the villages. If the weather was changing or something, they would move the village, to another part of their territory. They had vast territories. And, they would, they would follow, the food source, whether it was buffalo, deer, or rather, let's call it the game. They called it game, like, the birds or whatever. So if there wasn't food, they would go looking for food. And they would set up a village where the food was. or they would set up a village, you know, near the river where there was plenty of fish. If the fish got kind of sparse or scarce, they would go and set up a village where there were more fish. So the intention was to, you know, to make sure that the village people had enough to eat. And also, you know, they were able to build the villages. So they would need whatever plants they were using and trees, you know, to build their villages. Many of them had long houses. That they lived in long houses. No, they didn't all live in teepees. And there really is nothing wrong with living in a teepee. There was a reason that they lived like that, especially in areas that were prone to hurricanes and, you know, severe weather changes, even, you know, rain and things like that. So there was no one way that all of the people of this territory or the Americas lived, you know, because you know that the Incas and the Aztecs had different ways of, you know, different cultures than the people than the tribes that live here in what is now the United States or even Mexico. You know, it was just different. And and the borders were different. So the tribes were able to sustain themselves. The one family that I have been tracing was the Gibsons, Jane B-N-U Gibson. And Jane was born about 1640. And she was one of my oldest Native ancestors I've been able to trace here on the continental United States, in the United States, rather. So Jane had children, and she had a daughter, so she was called Jane the Elder, Jane Gibson the Elder. Then she had a daughter, Jane Gibson the Younger. So Jane the Younger married a Morris Evans. And Morris and Jane were the parents of my direct ancestors. Well, they were my direct ancestors too, and so was Jane the Elder. But Charles Evans is the father of Sally or Sarah Redcross Evans. And Charles married a Sarah Evans, and they had a child named Sarah Redcross Evans, and that is my direct descendant, and that is the person who was a part of the Monacan Indian Nation, and her husband Rawley Pinn, who was in the Revolutionary War. He was a Wicomico from Lancaster County, Virginia. So Sarah was up, and they were in Brunswick. They were, further up, and they owned land in what is now Amherst County, Virginia. But they were surveying that land as the native people were living there. So they would be in one county, like Loudoun County at one point, but then the land winds up in Amherst County. Like I said, they would come, and the Europeans were coming, and they would come on native people's lands, and then they would cut their land up, divide it up. And so that you're in one county, half of your land is in one county and half is in the other county. And it was clearly to run them off the land, to another means of them taking the land from them, the same way when they were cutting up the state, dividing and creating the states, and they would divide the land, like in Lancaster County, Virginia, and Northumberland, Well, that was all Indian territory. So they divided it. They cut it in half and made it into Northumberland, which was where the Episcopalian church was. They gave it, made it into a parish for the Episcopalians, and then the Anglican church was in Lancaster County. And before the borders of Maryland were created, it was the Wicomico were in Maryland and Virginia. So they created the borders and put their borders in so that it cut off half of the village and half of the Wicomico wound up in what is now the state of Maryland, and half were left in Northumberland and Lancaster County. And they did that throughout the colonies. And then as they took more and more land, they would do that throughout the, these United States and probably in South America too. But so Jane was, Jane the Elder left a testimony saying that her children were enslaved by Gordon Lightfoot. And Gordon Lightfoot was connected to the Shirley Plantation in Virginia, in what is now Virginia. And she said that the children, like they told them the children had to serve indentures. And so she was under the impression that those children would, would serve their indentures and come back home. And they never did. And she was on her deathbed. Jane said that they have taken my children. Gordon Lightfoot took my children and enslaved them. And we're not slaves. We're Indians. And he took them, and it's illegal. And she wanted people to find her children and free her children. And so Jane, the daughter, continued. Morris Evans, who was married to Jane's daughter, said the same thing. He said, they're enslaving our children. They're saying that we're Africans. We're not Africans. We're indigenous. We're natives. And he went to court. Morris Evans. He went to court about the children. Because, okay, if you were a slave and you had children, then those children were slaves too. And so he started, the court proceedings in Virginia, and that started a record, and that record ran for 3 or 4 generations until it was finally proven that they were illegally held, and they were Indians, and they were not, these were not Africans, Negroes, blacks, or whatever else title they wanted to put on them. So they became, they won their freedom through the court and left a record in Virginia that still exists today. And I was able to connect to that because they were suing Indians, their Saponi, Tutelo, and from, like everybody knows that about the Great Sioux Nation, but they did not know, and neither did I, that the Great Sioux Nation was also here in what is Virginia and North Carolina, how far they had traveled, which may have been, them trying to get away from the onslaught of the European settlers. We don't know, and it may have just been their territory. Again, like I say, they had wide swaths of territory that they would They would be in one territory for the summer, another one for the fall, another one for the winter, and another one for the spring. And that was the way that's how they lived. And to them, I mean, it's just like, Europeans come here and they have a summer house, they have a townhouse, and the main house, But when they talk about, oh, they weren't there when we got there was nobody there. That land was free, So they come and just took the land and squatted on the land and set up their government to give them a piece of paper saying, oh, that's their land, as if nobody else ever lived on that land or owned that land. So this was a situation with Jane Gibson and those children who were at the Shirley Plantation. They were slaves, and the Carters were in charge of that plantation, I believe at that time. It was part of the Carters. And I think there's the story going around about the Carters freeing all their slaves. Well, maybe the Carters realized that those slaves were actually Native Americans and not Africans. And maybe that's why they freed those slaves, But they didn't free them and pay them for the labor they took from them, So with Jane Gibson and her daughter, Jane the Younger, and Morris, I believe that it was Morris that was the one that was persistent, the Evans. But the Evans were actually remnants of Jane Gibson, because Jane the Younger was the daughter of Jane the Elder. So when they had children, they were coming up and saying those children are slaves, and we're taking the children or trying to take the children, and they were fighting in court to keep their children. And one of them was Morris's son Charles, who is my direct ancestor, and Charles was married Sarah Evans. Excuse me. Charles Evans married Sarah Redcross. And so my ancestor was called Sarah Redcross Evans. And I think that the Red Cross name, because they knew that the Red Crosses were Native, that Sarah Redcross, my ancestor, wanted that middle name in case they came and tried to enslave her. They were trying to break the line that was being crossed by these, Gordon Lightfoot, and I think they called them Captain or Colonel or something, I don't know. But these are the lines that I was tracing, and I was able to find the paper trail through the courts, because the Evans went through the courts. Morris went to court. Charles went to court. And so my ancestor, Charles's daughter, Sarah, was not a slave, but they had to serve indentures. And in fact, Charles left land for Sarah. So when he passed, he left Sarah with land. But I believe this was their land as natives, people. And it was up around Amherst County, because these counties were being formed. So what they would do was they would own the land or have possession of the land, and then the surveyors would come and cut their land off so that it was in two counties. So the land that Sarah owned was in, I think it was in Nelson and Amherst County. And that's where her and her husband, Rawley Pinn, lived. And they were by a creek. They had quite a large plantation or farm up there. And at one point, they were, Rawley, during the Revolutionary War, was called to fight. So he was a Minuteman. And I don't know if most of you all know or have heard of the Minutemen, but that was a term I thought they only used in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts, during the Revolutionary War, they had Minutemen. That means they could call them up and they would be there in a minute. So this was the status of Rawley Pinn and other Native people and other so-called mulatto people that lived up in the Amherst County, which is a mountainous area over by West Virginia. And they called him a militia, and they were called Minutemen. And when the time came, they marched to Yorktown. So all of these men were in the same unit. These were so-called mulatto, free persons of color, or whatever you want to call them. They did not call them Indian, but I know that my ancestors were Native. I know the tribes they belonged to, and that they were indigenous to Virginia. And also, they were probably, not indigenous to Virginia, indigenous to the region. And they were probably thinking that, oh yeah, we'll go fight the British because they're the ones that brought over slavery. And thinking that once you get rid of the British, the slavery, that would be the end of the enslavement and the forced labor. Because anytime anybody's serving an indenture, that's labor, that's slavery by another name. Like you serve a 30-year indenture if you're a woman, and 25 years if you're a male. That's indenture, that's forced labor. And they don't get paid for that. They didn't get paid for that. And also, if the woman had children while she was indentured, those children would automatically be indentured. Okay, and so when Rawley and the unit he was with marched out of Amherst County, Virginia, they met up with Marcus de Lafayette and his unit, and they marched to Yorktown, and they were a part of the siege of Yorktown, which was the last battle of the Revolutionary War under General Washington. George Washington was there. And so they were a part of that, the men fighting. And for me to find the roster, the roster was in the College of William and Mary. They have what is called a SWEM, SWEM library. And there are many colonial records there that are reference what, the Native American and Native people, what tribes they were in, and even have records of what their names were, meaning their native names. And College of William and Mary has set up a school for the chief's sons. So they were going from tribe to tribe and taking the sons of the chief and to the College of William and Mary to assimilate them. Because, the College of William and Mary is, of course, connected to the Church of England. And they had a school there, and many of the children didn't survive. They didn't get home. If they did get back to their tribes, they were broken. But the point of that, it was to assimilate them, make them leaders who would go back to the tribe and convert the tribe to be more receptive to colonialism and to being Christians. So that is how they were. That's how they were managing to create, these natives who would do what they wanted them to do. How they were able to pressure the Cherokee into accepting slavery, and then talk about the 5 civilized tribes, the ones that were willing to have slaves. And we need to use our brains and think about how long it took them to break down these tribes who had no knowledge of slavery. How do you break them down and get them to accept enslaving other human beings? And that's what they were doing. They were taking them away from their tribes, like they do in the Catholic Church with the mission schools. And they've been doing that. They were doing it with the Episcopalians. They were doing it with the Church of England. And the Catholics were doing it, of course. And the point was to assimilate them. And that would be one way of getting the land, getting control of the land and the resources. So this was Jane Gibson. Children had to be brown. They had to not be like the ones that they continue to portray as so light that they almost, that light skin came after they began intermixing with the native women. And those children were lighter, and they were getting treated. They were being educated to become supportive of the colonizer. They wanted, this was their way of connecting to the land. And they did that in Africa too. It's nothing new, But Jane, even with her dying breath, she was talking about her children. And so that what she said on her deathbed was carried along until those children, were eventually found to be Indian, and that they were enslaved unlawfully. It took 3 or 4 generations of that to happen. And so I think that her story is important when we're talking about who is native, who is indigenous, and looking at somebody's skin color and saying, oh, no, you're not because you're da-da-da-da-da. You can't know whether or not someone is native or indigenous just by looking at them. And there, the portrayal of many of my ancestors, and that includes the Iroquois, my Mohawk ancestors, my Seneca ancestors, how they lightened them up. There's one of the ancestors, Queen Aliquippa, who was the head of the Iroquois, and she's a brown woman. She did not have the features that they show you, that they want to present as, oh, this is a native, feature. There is no one native feature. And, so they didn't even, want to talk about Queen Aliquippa because she doesn't look like their stereotypical Indian. And the ones that I know that I have seen that even in my family looked nothing like the stereotypical Indian. There is no stereotypical, they come in all shapes and sizes. Some are real tall, some are, short, some are medium, you know. And the fact that I was able to go back and find Jane, you know, was because somebody else had also started that search and found that this is who we are, and this is how we're related, and this is who the Evans are. So when I go back to Amherst County and I say Evans, they say, oh, well, that's, you know, that's Sarah. Sarah was married to Rawley Pinn. Sarah's mother was Sarah Redcross Pinn, and Sarah was this, that, and the other. And they just ran it down. And said, oh, well, that's who you are. Then you're Monacan, because they were Saponi. And they were Saponi. They're Sioux, you know. They were Tutelo, Saponi, and they came from the Great Sioux Nation. That's who your ancestors are. And that is how I was, you know, I registered with the tribe. And I registered with the tribe in 1998 when they were just state recognized and were struggling to get federal recognition. And that didn't happen for a while. But the point is to be persistent, to know, okay, where were your people? Go look in the county records. Go look at a map and say and find out if you believe that you're indigenous to that land. Look at a map and see what tribes were there, and follow them. A lot of them were sent to Oklahoma, you know, or they're somewhere in the Midwest. They're in North or South Dakota. They're in the Dakotas. They're in the Ohio Valley. Where were they? And where were they sent? Some of them went up into Canada. You have to do your due diligence and find out who they are. And if nothing else works, sometimes you know, just ask the ancestors. They're right there. They want to tell you. They will guide you if you believe. You know, some of y'all just believe that it began and ended with Christianity. We don't all believe that. Long before there were Christians, we were a spiritual people. We believe in creation, preserving the earth, preserving the resources, and keeping, you know, nobody can stop you from doing that. And they, even in the hardest of times, you know, that's when you really need to, you know, ask yourself. Like when I'm asking myself, I'm actually asking the ancestors, because they're the ones guiding me. I'm always guided by my ancestors. And so I wanted to, you know, share that with you. If you have any questions, please let me know. And if you want to, you know, appear on my podcast, you're more than welcome. I'm just asking that you subscribe, share, like, you know, support. If you can, hey, send in some, you know, a couple of bucks or so to Cash App, $ WILLS 920. All donations are welcome and accepted. And I will see you out there soon. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments. Thank you, everyone. Good night.